in the newspapers today, the British newspapers, there was a story about President Putin, and that it was being discussed in the Kremlin that he would become Verkhovny Pravitel. Verkhovny Pravitel. And that was translated into English as Supreme Leader. And I wondered when I read that how that would be reported in Russia. Perhaps it's already been reported and the British papers have just picked it up, but it would be interesting to know how it was reported, if it was reported, and what the commentary about it was. What did people in opinion columns say about it? How would it be treated in the news? But my subject is about ethics in journalism. Quite a lot of people who criticize journalism say it's a kind of contradiction in terms. That to say that ethics, to talk about ethics in journalism is to talk about something which is hardly there. And that's something which is said about the British press, the British tabloid press especially, but I think unfairly. I think there are ethics in journalism, that they are here in the UK, in the West, in most countries. They are defended both by journalists and others, and they are important. So two things to say at the beginning. One, that ethics in journalism must, of course, be upheld by journalists, but journalists themselves, we ourselves, cannot be sure that ethics exist in journalism. Ethics in journalism depend on much more than journalists. And secondly, journalism must be independent. That is, that when you're reporting, you should be free to try to tell the truth as far as possible, as far as you know it. Always simply a sketch, not the full truth, but everywhere. But journalism should be independent in that sense. It should be independent in the sense that you're free to tell the truth as you understand it, as you can find out, but also people who comment on opinion columns in the newspapers, opinion in television and radio and so on, should also be free. People should be free to say what they like about the government, about the state, and about a variety of events in the news. For example, in Britain, you may have gathered that there was a lot of opinion as well as news about Harry and Meghan, one of the royal princes, and his wife, who had been an actress in Hollywood. And there was huge amounts of opinion. There was news, of course, some news, but it was, in the newspapers especially, it was much outweighed by the opinion. And people divided into two camps, a bit like Remain and Brexit. It was pro-Meghan and Harry, especially pro-Meghan, and against Meghan and Harry. And it still goes on now, so because the royal family in this country is regarded as being very important, and is important in the sense that the Queen is the head of state. She must sign all legislation. She doesn't have a choice, actually. She has to sign all legislation, but anyway, she has to sign it, so she's important. I said that journalism must be independent, but is everywhere also dependent. It depends on a number of things. It depends on money. Journalism is quite expensive. And the more investigative it is, the more that you inquire into things, you have to travel more, you have to spend more time on the investigation, then the more money it costs. So very often the most important journalism is the most expensive journalism. Journalism depends on laws, the laws of the country. And laws regulate journalism. In this country and others, they regulate that it should be free, as well as set certain limits on it. It puts more limits in this country on television, on broadcasting, and very few on newspapers. And in fact, RT, Russia Today channel, which has a British office and broadcasts in Britain, had to pay a fine to the regulator of broadcasting because it didn't observe the law, the regulation, which said that it had to be fair about political parties. If it said something about one political party, it had to balance that with another, with saying something about another, or having a voice which is critical about that political party or political person. And it didn't do that, and so it was fined quite a lot of money. So journalism has to work under laws. It works under conventions, by which I mean the kind of beliefs in the country and in the government and in the state about what journalism should be, how free it should be, whether it should be able to say anything or have certain limits. And in most Western democracies, these conventions tend to, not always, but tend to support freedom of commentary, freedom of news, so on. But it depends upon these conventions, these beliefs of what journalism should be, as much as it does on laws. It depends on a liberal spirit, not liberal with a capital L, or not liberal like Mr. Zhirinovsky, but it depends upon being liberal in the sense that, in the sense of freedom, that it depends upon a society which accepts at least, or even believes in, the need for free information, because information for citizens is essential. Criticism of powerful institutions and people is essential. People have come to believe that, even if at times they dislike the press, dislike journalism for doing it. It depends on a government which is more or less transparent. That is, that people can understand what the government does and know about something about the Prime Minister, the main ministers in the cabinet. They have some sense of how government works. It must be open to that. Many people don't understand very much about government. They accept that it's there. They grumble about it sometimes, but by and large, they don't know huge amounts about it, but they know enough about it to accept it, usually. At other times, sometimes they get very angry, and sometimes there are protests, but day by day, most people accept it, because the government has been open enough for them to understand it, to learn about it if they wish. At the moment, there is a dispute between journalists and Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, because he no longer has interviews on the main morning radio program, news program called Today. His main advisor has said that the Today journalists are too rude, too aggressive, and the Prime Minister will not appear on it. And journalists say that interviews have to be challenging, have to be sharp, have to ask hard questions that politicians don't want to answer. But for the moment, at least, the Prime Minister doesn't appear on the Today programme. Money, which I said was essential for journalism, comes mainly from two sources, everywhere, more or less. One source is the state. Public broadcasting gets money in one form or another through the state or from the state. In this country, the BBC gets money from a tax which goes directly to the BBC, called the license fee. In other countries, public broadcasting comes from tax revenue, from the taxes people pay, which is not defined as tax for broadcasting, but is assigned to the broadcaster in order to keep it going. And in that case, when money comes through the state, then there have to be safeguards that the state does not put pressure on the broadcasters to do what it wishes them to do. There's always an argument about it, sometimes an argument here in BBC, there's arguments in France, in Spain, in Italy, all about the pressure that the state puts on public broadcasters. The other way of getting money for the media is from private companies and individuals. That is, companies, rich people who buy newspapers, buy channels, control these newspapers and channels, and usually have a certain point of view, which maybe very often is to the right, sometimes to the left. The most famous private individual certainly in the West is Rupert Murdoch, an Australian who now lives in America and who has newspapers and TV channels all over the Western world, in America, in Britain, in Australia, where he came from, and elsewhere. And he is regarded as one of the most powerful people in the world because he has these means of information. And because his opinions, his ideas, which are on the right, quite strongly on the right sometimes, are influential in the minds of his editors. Doesn't mean to say they always do exactly how he thinks, but they tend to go along that way. I said it also depends upon that journalism depends upon laws. Usually laws which lay down, which say that journalism should be free. There is a part of the Russian constitution which says that journalism should be free. The most famous of these laws is the one which was passed by the founders of the United States in the late 18th century. They drew up a constitution. And in that constitution, it said that Congress, the main parliament of the United States, Congress shall make no law reducing freedom of speech or freedom of the press. And that, it also said something about religion being free, other issues being free, but journalists seize upon that. No law which reduces the freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And that's remained constant since the late 18th century till now. There have been many battles around it. It's often been a matter for the courts, but it's remained. It's remained central to the idea of democracy in the United States. In this country, there is no law which says journalism should be free. Old laws which controlled journalism, which were which censored journalism, which put limits upon it, have been repealed, are no longer there, and there is an assumption that the press and broadcasters should be free, but there is no particular law which actually says it must be free. It's one of these peculiarities of Britain, because Britain has no constitution, no written document laying out the main legal basis of the state. It's simply evolved into a state which has a more or less free media, free journalism. I said that convention was possible because there has to be an understanding in society that journalism is valuable. There has to be a liberal spirit, a general feeling in society, and not just among citizens, but also among civil servants, officials, and of course politicians, that it should be free even if it upsets people, and a government which is transparent, but also one which doesn't see its job as enriching itself and its members, but does see its job mainly as providing efficient government. The final thing which is really important about journalism, especially investigative journalism, is that it has to have an effect. That is, that when something is written or shown on television, an investigative report, for example, which shows corruption, that has to have an effect in society. That is, if the report uncovers corruption, say, or covering up the truth, then the law has to come in, the law has to ask questions about it if it seems to be a well-founded report. It has to make a difference. And in many countries, when journalism reveals something, when it shows corruption, shows a cover-up, it doesn't have any effect. It's published, it's shown on television, but it has no effect. So there has to be a link between the journalism and the legal system and what happens to what journalists discover in order for it to be effective. So you can have theoretically, you can have a free press which doesn't have any effect. It's simply ignored. All of these things are necessary for freedom in journalism, and it's a lot to have. Many countries have some of that, but don't have it all. Some countries have hardly any of it. There's a man with whom I worked in Romania recently, actually an American professor who has been in Romania for some years, teaching journalism, working as a political scientist in a university in Romania. And he retired recently, and he wrote something about what he thought about journalism in Romania and, by extension, all states which had gone through communism and were now post-communist societies, as they say. And he said, Westerners, people from the West, like himself, had unrealistic expectations about the speed and extent of democratization and liberalization in post-communist countries. So the perception that the development of mass media in these countries, that they have failed, is not surprising, because the expectation of success was so high. These were failures, he wrote, only if we consider that the mass media are independent agents of democratization. That is, that the mass media themselves, journalism itself, can democratize, can help democratize societies. If we believe that, then we're disappointed because the expectation was not realistic. In general, he wrote, the media in former communist countries, and certainly in Romania, have remained unprofessional, often corrupt and corruptible, subordinated to political economic power, operating in corrupt political and cultural climates. A small segment has become freer, investigative, and so on. Indeed, in Romania, there are a number of journalists who are like that and who have exposed corruption, and actually, a little while ago, have been able to put in prison a man who led the Social Democratic Party because they revealed his corruption, and it could not be denied, and some judges pursued it, and there was an effect. So that is tends to be quite rare. But there's a scale of freedoms now in the world. In dictatorships, where absolute power is held by one individual or one party, usually the individual at the head of the party, then journalism can't work at all freely. It must simply be the voice of the ruling party, of the ruling individual. It can't have ethical journalism. It can't have journalism which is free in any sense. The journalist must do what the state or the state party lays down that they must do. The obvious example of that, which is nearly always the bottom of any ranking of freedom in the media, is North Korea, where there is an all-powerful leader, Kim Jong-un, our beloved leader, and what he says, what he does, what the party says and does is always what is written in the newspapers and broadcast on television. Apparently 90% of the news is what the leader does on any given day. If he doesn't do much, which apparently Kim Jong-un often doesn't, then they remind people of what he did the day before. But there are now 4 million cell phones, 4 million mobile phones in North Korea, which could mark a change. People can speak on their mobile phones. They're always controlled. You have to sign a document that you won't misuse them. That is, you won't say anything bad about the regime. Nevertheless, they've got 4 million phones. And 4 million phones, the iPhone, might mean a problem, a continuing problem for the regime. Authoritarian countries, which vary in how authoritarian they are more common. Dictatorships like North Korea, like Eritrea, one or two others, are rare now. There are various kinds of authoritarian countries where there is often some freedom, sometimes, compared to the past, quite a lot of freedom. But it's restricted. It's restricted, for example, in Egypt. Much more than before, when Egypt was, before the Arab Spring, when Egypt was ruled by a series of military officers, there was increasingly, especially under Mubarak, the last of these, more space to be critical, at least mildly, to write about and broadcast about corruption and so on. The Arab Spring, then the military, the leader, the chief of the general staff, El-Sisi, came to power, has remained in power, and he has brought in an authoritarian regime stricter, much stricter than the previous. Many journalists have been put in jail, some have been tortured, and there is very little journalism of any kind of freedom. In Turkey, not quite so bad, but there are more journalists, at least as many journalists in prison in Turkey for writing against the regime, the government, President Erdogan. There had been for some time 50 or 60 journalists in Turkish prisons for being against the regime. There are fewer now, but still, the media is very much controlled. In Saudi Arabia, there are many journalists that are still in prison. Again, allegations of torture have been used against them. And although the new prince there in Saudi Arabia is trying to liberalize society, journalism hasn't changed much. The journalists can't do much, don't have much space to write or to broadcast. In China, journalists are also in prison. Xi Jinping has cracked down on what was, for a while, a relatively open society, a relatively open media, relative to the past. Now it's been brought sharply back. The only part of China which has relatively free journalism is Hong Kong. And you've seen in the last months the demonstrations in Hong Kong, partly mainly aimed at retaining the democracy that they have there, but also at retaining the freedom of their media. In Russia, again, I say you should tell me what happens. There had been quite a few journalists in prison. I think, I may be wrong in this. There are very few now, if any. The problem that you face, or your colleagues face, is very often not so much the state, but assassination by others. The most famous, actually, in the West, and I guess also in Russia, is Anna Politkovskaya, now some years ago, when she was murdered in her own apartment block. It was assumed by killers from Chechnya, because she wrote mainly about Chechnya, very critically against the regime there, and paid a high price for it, the highest price for it. But many of you will remember on the first day of this conference, when we were still at the Oxford University, where Martin Harris, who is a UK diplomat, had been deputy ambassador in Moscow and ambassador in Ukraine. He talked about the media at the end of his talk, and he was very optimistic, you remember? He said that what's happening in Russia now, and often is not recognized in the West, is actually a much greater freedom, a much greater space opened up for journalists to write, to criticize, to reveal. And that he put down mainly to the web and to social media. In other words, the ability to put stuff onto the web, the great expansion of the net, people using the net all the time, getting much of their news and opinion from it, and the fact that the Russian government does not censor, has spoken about it, but again, correct me if I'm wrong later, the fact that it doesn't censor the net means that Russian citizens have access to it, and especially younger people go on the net rather than watch television or buy newspapers, as happens everywhere. In every country in the world now, people are, especially younger people, are leaving the traditional carriers of news and opinion, newspapers, magazines, and broadcasters, and going to the net and finding what they want there, getting it from social media. What many believe is that democracy and the freedom of the media has come slowly in Western societies. And because it's come slowly, it means it has a relatively firm base. It's very difficult to cut back. Not impossible, but so far has not been done. And there were three countries which stand out. One, not often mentioned, is Sweden, where a monk called Chydenius in the late 18th century began writing about the need for freedom, all kinds of freedom, freedom of trade, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press. And he really, for the first time, made the case that freedom was essential both for the citizens to have information about their country, because they were citizens and they needed information, but also essential for the rulers, so that they knew what people were thinking, that they themselves got information, and therefore government could become more efficient. And he wrote a book about this, which was published. It was the time when Sweden also had Finland as part of it, before the Finns broke away. Should any of us actually lived in what is now Finland, and the book had an effect. A law came in even then on freedom of the press. It was later taken out of the constitution, but it then came back in again. And Sweden and Denmark and Norway and Finland remain usually the countries which are seen as being the freest in the terms of the media. Then there was the United Kingdom, and in the Civil War in the 17th century, excuse me, in the 17th century, there, where the side of the king and the side of the Parliament, with Oliver Cromwell as the main leader, Charles I, then the king, there was a civil war, a clash between the two sides, and pamphlets, short books, essays began to appear, arguing one case and arguing the other. And it was, the authorities tried to suppress them. And John Milton, who was a famous poet, but also a political figure, wrote a short book called Areopagitica, which argued the case for freedom of opinion, so that people could express what they felt in order to inform and to influence citizens. It was a new idea, so it has grown bit by bit, but he first put it into very powerful prose, and it remains still a key text for freedom of the press. And then later, 2 centuries later, a political philosopher called John Stuart Mill wrote an essay, still much quoted, called On Liberty. And in On Liberty, he too, but more radically than Milton, argued that freedom of speech and freedom of the press were absolutely essential to a society. Again, arguing that people needed information in order to be citizens, that governments needed information in order to govern well, and that no opinion, no matter how unpopular, no matter how small it was, how few people believed it, no opinion should be suppressed. And that too has remained as a kind of a bedrock. There's always a debate about that. Shouldn't some opinions be stopped if they're dangerous, for example? And there is a number of exceptions to absolute freedom, which are always argued about. But the basis is, if you like, the default position is that there should be, every opinion should have its place. And then the other one is United States. I said that when the founders of the United States drew up a constitution, they put in the First Amendment freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and that too has remained absolute bedrock of American journalism. Again, many debates about it, many fights about it. There's lots of fights now around President Trump, who doesn't like a lot of the media, likes Fox News, but doesn't like much else. So he has not tried to censor. He knows he couldn't do that. But there are always fights about the media. President Trump calls the news he doesn't like fake news. He especially criticizes CNN, the broadcaster CNN, but also the New York Times and the Washington Post, all of which are liberal and are against him. So there's always fights. But the right of these channels and these newspapers and magazines to write what they wish, broadcast what they wish, remains essentially really unchallenged. And also in the United States, what has happened more than any other country is that journalism remains at the very center of politics. In Britain, it is important, but it's not. It comes and goes. But in the United States, the central arguments of politics usually bring in the media at some point. There were two figures in the 1930s and 40s, two intellectuals who had a debate about this, which remains interesting to read. One, Walter Lippmann, who himself was a broadcaster. Another one, John Dewey, who was a political philosopher. And they argued as to what journalism should do. And they had different opinions. Lippmann thought that journalism was too sloppy, got facts too wrong, and it should be supplemented by centers which put out correct news, kind of rather perhaps academic, semi-academic, semi-journalistic, but it was essential, he said, for a well-run society that news should be accurate. Dewey was much more in the sort of spirit of the founders of the revolution, the American Revolution, and said that okay, so sometimes journalism was sloppy, but actually it should be free. It should be free to be sloppy. And that has remained. Dewey won that argument, and it's remained so. Finally, just to say that I've talked a lot about, and journalists talk a lot about the state and the threat of the state on journalism. And that's right. The state is the great threat to free journalism if it wishes to be, because it's got more power. It's got the power of the police, the secret services. It's got the power to put people in jail. It's got the power to stop publication. All of these powers it has, it can do. And in some countries it does do. But there are other threats. And one of the threats, which has been true in Russia as well, but even more true elsewhere, is fear. That journalists fear to write or to broadcast certain things. The main country which shows this most clearly is Mexico. And Mexico has had more deaths, more murders of journalists than any other, by factor of many factors. What happens in Mexico, and what is still happening, although it's reduced from what it was, is that journalists who have clearly enormous courage write about crime. And above all, they write about the drug cartels in Mexico, who are very powerful, very, very rich, and very violent. Indeed, Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, Foreign Minister in the Obama government, talked about a civil war between the government of Mexico and the crime gangs. In other words, it was that serious. 35,000 people died, not journalists, but people died in clashes between the drug cartels and the government in, I think it was 2017 or 2017. Even now it's less, but less in that last year, 2019, 30 journalists were killed by the drug gangs, or it is thought by the drug gangs. That's an awful lot. That's more than in any other country. And most journalists are fearful, are fearful. So the control is by fear. It happened in Italy, less again now, when Italian journalists wrote about the mafia, in Sicily, in Calabria in the south, around Naples, 3 big centers for different mafia gangs. When they wrote about them, they were under threat. One journalist was killed last year, but 200 journalists, 200 Italian journalists, have got the police, a police guard. They go everywhere with guards around them in order to protect them, because it is assumed that the threat made very often by the mafia is real. In other countries, the threat is less, but there have been two big examples recently where two journalists have been killed, investigative journalists who are looking into business and political links and corruption. Two have been killed. One, Jan Kuciak in Slovakia, who was killed with his fiancée when they were walking back home one night. And the other one, I think last year or the year before, was Daphne Galizia in Malta. Malta, a small island state. She also was looking into corruption in the Maltese government, and she was killed. In both cases, there have been a huge reaction against that, public reaction. And in both cases, the Prime Minister had to resign, or did resign. In the case of Slovakia, Fico, who had been a long-serving Prime Minister, resigned. His party continued in power, I think still does continue in power, but he had to go, or he went anyway. In Malta, the Prime Minister resigned. I think the government is still the same, but there is still a very large debate about it, large protests still, because people have not yet been brought to justice. In other words, what seems to have happened in these both terrible occasions is that the positive side of it is that people wanted to show their support for what these journalists were doing, i.e. Showing corruption in governments which the public very often knew, or suspected at least, were corrupt. And these journalists were out to prove. So fear, then, is at least, in some societies, at least as much of a threat as the state. My last word. Ethics in journalism means essentially trying to find out the truth and keeping opinion free, or making opinion free. Doing it ethically, in that journalists don't intimidate people, they don't bribe, they check their facts, and they only publish when they believe they have the truth. That, of course, can be contested, but that's the basis of what we might call ethical journalism. We don't always do that. We don't always obey it. We often take shortcuts. But that's the basis of our trade. It's the way in which we can take it seriously, and the way in which others can take it seriously, and it can get support. The truth is always difficult to get because it's always complicated. Even a very apparently simple story is always complicated. And when you talk to people, and I'm sure you found this out, to try to get the story of what happened from a witness who saw something, from people who had talked to other people who are being investigated and so on, you get different stories. It's very difficult sometimes to know what is the truth. If you weren't there. If you were there, saw it with your own eyes, heard it with your own ears, then that's different. But if you're trying to re-establish, to recreate a story from other people's evidence, it's difficult because it's often contradictory. But you just have to try to see what is the most likely explanation and do that. And news will always be, as I said earlier, a kind of a sketch. Perhaps 10%, if you're lucky, of what actually happened will be the news. 10% of something which people can agree is more or less the truth. It's good going. It's well done if you can get that much. So it's always partial. It's always open to debate and dispute. It's always difficult to do well. But my point today is that for us, those of you, which I think are most of you, is that it's always essential. It's a good job if it's done well. Indeed, it's a necessary job, and it's necessary to try to do it well. Thank you.